Well, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Sierra McKinney, who is finishing up her anthropology PhD at the Université de Montréal. Sierra received her BA from the University of Victoria in BC in 2017 and in anthropology. She then went on in 2018 to do an MSc in digital heritage, which she was awarded with distinction at the University of York in the UK, Department of Archaeology, before starting her PhD at Montreal in 2020. Her PhD research has been supported by several doctoral scholarships, including a prestigious Shirk doctoral scholarship, a J.A. de Sèvres Excellence Scholarship from the basically the National Research in Quebec Institute, and a Museodoc Scholarship from the University of Montreal. She's already published or has in press at least 7 papers that I could see, referee papers, plus several others on her research by leading publishers such as Routledge, and in journals such as the International Journal of the Inclusive Museum and the Journal on Computing and Cultural Heritage. Her PhD dissertation is entitled Managing Shame and Guilt on Decolonizing Practice in Canadian Heritage Context, and that an aspect of that will be the focus of her talk tonight, that is specifically entitled Addressing Colonial Guilt with Artefact-Centred Dialogue. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sierra.
Thank you so much. That sounds so fancy. I really appreciate that. So I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to talk today. It's one of my first kind of community talks out with other archaeologists. I've presented at a lot of conferences about this, but I was very touched to be asked to present, and thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. So I also want to do a brief land acknowledgement just because I am in a different place. I'm currently in Montreal. And with that, I am on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, or the Mohawk First Nation. You heard though, I did a lot of my degrees on the West Coast. I grew up in Alberta, so I have done this work, and with the help of some museums as well, done this exact research throughout a lot of this country. And I'm just like to acknowledge that I'm here as a settler, and I'm very grateful to be able to do this work in this context. So for today, we're going to have hopefully not too long of a presentation, but we're going to be covering a little bit of where the kind of field currently stands as it relates to dealing with negative emotions. So emotions, I'm coming more from a museum background currently, but also within archaeology as itself, the good, the bad, and the ugly. What we're kind of doing as the field response, so how we're addressing these things. And then I'm going to be presenting the main bulk of my research, which is actually designing a kind of program for visitor engagement that will help settler Canadians engage with these negative or difficult emotions for productive use, I guess, for productive reconciliation. So how do we encourage people to recognize and address these things in a way that's healthy for them and also positive for our society? And I have the beginning of my research kind of done. I'm still doing some of my analysis for my second set of data collection, but I'll give you some of my initial findings. If at any point you guys do have questions, I think that we normally do them at the end, but I'm pretty chill, so you can also pop on. It's all good. So emotions in the field, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So as I said, my current kind of work is more centered in museum practice. What do we do with the archaeological artifacts that we find after we have taken them out of the ground? How do we use those within our museums and our cultural heritage spaces for education? So when I looked at the question of how things are being addressed emotionally in the museum, that's kind of where I wanted to start. Now, I think a lot of what I've said here can also be applied to people engaging with archaeology directly. It's just something that most of the time in Canada, most people have to engage with archaeology through that kind of museum space versus on-site. But having said that, I think a lot of the comments that I'm going to make here apply to people who have the opportunity to engage with archaeological artifacts one-on-one, on-site, or in other like heritage spaces. So museums are increasingly trying to like evoke specific emotions. This is something that the literature has kind of seen a shift in over the last 10 years. But even before that, they've always been really emotional spaces. So I really enjoyed this series of surveys that was done by the Canadian Museum Association, specifically the Alberta Museum Association, which looked at a series of questionnaires, which I was talking about earlier, as to how people felt about museums. And the ones that really stood out to me were the high percentages of people who looked at these things and were like, this makes me proud. It increases my attachment. It is a way to, develop curiosity. All of these emotions that are generally seen as fairly positive. So 93% of respondents agree that museums spark curiosity, provoke wonder, promote creativity, a love of learning. All of these emotions, these are the ones that most museums are trying to create. They're trying to provide an environment where people have those very positive emotions. And they're succeeding at it. 93% is absolutely amazing. And this is tied in part to deeper understandings of the ties between memory, learning, emotion, and action. So the idea that emotion is actually one of those things that produce learning opportunities and also help people remember. So lots of different studies have been done that have indicated that when people have an emotional engagement with the kind of information that they're given, they're more likely to retain that going forward, which is, I think, why we're starting to see some of these kind of drives to create positive emotions in museums. Also because heritage is just inherently emotional. And then museums as well are also starting to talk about some of the broader social issues beyond just kind of strict history. So we're seeing these larger discussions, and those larger discussions are going to be inherently emotional. Which brings us to the bad. And this is my favorite image, one of the few I have in my presentation. It's what happens when you Google sad woman at museum. This is the first kind of free open access image that you get. And I really feel like it displays a lot of vibes. So one of those things that, we are noticing is that emotions in the museum and heritage spaces are not only limited to joy and wonder. It's not just curiosity and excitement. Visitors also experience grief, anger, sadness, guilt, shame. This came a lot from studies that were done in the UK, looking at the bicentennial anniversary of the Abolition of Slavery Act and how people were engaging with those sorts of museum displays. Having said that, though, I think you can go into any museum and you'll find people really experiencing the broad range of human emotion. And how these negative emotions manifest are going to differ on each person. Each person's going to come in with a different background, different experiences, and that's going to impact how they feel and experience the objects on display. So this is one of those studies that I mentioned about the bicentennial. And this was the quote that actually really got me started on this part of my research. I read this during my master's degree and I was like, wait a second. So exhibition strategies and interpretive materials may need to provide the resources and skills for visitors to navigate the emotions that visitors may bring to or that are triggered by their visits. Negative emotions, such as guilt and shame, were controversial and difficult issues for a significant set of those interviewed for this study. So multiple people in these kind of interviews that they did brought up the words guilt, brought up the word shame without prompting. This was just something that they experienced. And that came in different ways. If you read the quote, some people are clearly upset about it. Some people are mad that they're people are trying to make them feel guilty, but it was definitely something that was happening in this space. And then this has been repeated in other studies since then. So why should we worry? This is the ugly. I think as archaeologists and people working in the heritage field, there's three main reasons, although these are by no means the only three. And they're also not in any order, as you can see, because the number 3 has magically become another number 1. So we have an educational mandate. The first thing that we need to do in museum spaces and in heritage spaces is tell the truth about the past that we're presenting. And so acknowledging these emotions, working with these emotions does help people learn. Again, that's already been established. But also, we don't really have another option. We're going to be dealing with history that is upsetting and difficult if we tell the story correctly. And we can't not tell the story correctly. So option 1 is kind of taken away. We need to make sure that we're doing this right. And that means that we are addressing these histories. Tied to that is the fact that we have a duty of care to our visitors. When we bring people into our heritage information, when we bring people into museum spaces, when we work with them in archaeological sites, we are working with them. They are our partners, they are our visitors, and we have a duty of care to them, in my opinion. You can't bring people in and say, everything was awful, everything is awful, it's all bad, have a nice day. That doesn't really help anyone. If we are going to be providing a space where these feelings are evoked and are created, I think that it's part of our responsibility to help them address those places and leave them kind of back out of the valley to a place where we can be positive moving forward. And that brings me to the third one as well, which is we have a wider social responsibility. So what we do when we work in our heritage kind of sector does impact wider society. It does impact wider societal views, laws, all of that sort of thing. Now that's very pie in the sky, but I do think there's a trickle effect. And so we have a responsibility to make sure that the information that we provide to people is correct, but also that we provide it in a way that means that we are creating social good. And that ties to something that's going to come up a little bit later, which is that when we have these people feeling these negative emotions and they're unaddressed, it often creates really negative consequences where people are either mentally suffering themselves, or alternatively get very, very defensive, stop believing things, start challenging things. We're seeing that firsthand with people kind of saying, residential school burials are faked, all of that sort of stuff. We need to do what we can to try and cap that. So, negative emotions, as I said, do have this larger negative impact. Specifically, they provoke learners to resist, avoid, or abandon learning about challenging materials. And they can create feelings of intense anger, depression, a desire to isolate oneself. So a lot of my research was actually based in psychology, which when you do a research presentation on guilt and shame, you'd think you'd expect, but still somehow I was surprised and shocked how much psychology papers I had to read. But all of this kind of came to the idea that this is something that we need to address. Otherwise, it's not going to work very well. And we are going to have these negative impacts, which again go against our mandate for learning and our other social goals. So to kind of sum it up, and then I'm going to move past this very quickly, we can't avoid it. Our visitors do want it. Going back to that questionnaire, you have people saying we need to hear the harsh truths, we need to hear the truth at all, but we have a duty to help them. And then we also have to have a duty to our larger community. What are the lessons that we're sharing? What are the impacts that we're creating? And last but not least, I do also want to do a little note here with who is left with this fallout and who does this labor. And this comes a little bit to my own kind of identity as well. I am a settler Canadian. I am a good old-fashioned mix of British, Irish, Scottish, Ukrainian, and Swedish. It's like that pure settler, every type of European you can be. And that has impacted a lot of my research with this. It kind of has informed how I have approached these things. And because a lot of times when we're working within heritage spaces, the labor is left with the Indigenous community to kind of take on the burden of our own negative emotions, which is in of itself not necessarily very fair or right. So I think that is also just a thing that I like to mention. It is still going to have to be done. So who has to do it? Which brings me to the field's response. So what are we doing? Well, it's complicated. The answer in some ways is not a lot. So negative emotions are rarely officially addressed in museum settings. There is not a lot of policy around them, not a lot of practice guidance, anything like that. On-site excavation and archaeological work is actually a little bit better. There's policies around how we're going to do ceremony, commemoration, work with community, which all plays a really critical role in addressing the negative emotions, both by those descendant communities, but also for the archaeologists on site. And, again, different people are going to have different experiences with this. Different people are going to bring in different kind of beliefs. And sometimes that ceremony might help address a negative emotion like guilt or shame. Sometimes it might not. But it is still something. And that's something that is sometimes done at museums, but less consistently, I would say. Having said that, there is some great work being done especially in regards to kind of grief and sadness. So in museum settings, we do see broader collaboration with descendant and impacted communities. We're seeing kind of the addition of additional training. So one of the really great examples was for the African American Museum of History for the Smithsonian. They provided significant trauma-informed and care-based training practices, because I thought that those people who are going to be working in the museum on the floor were going to have to be dealing with some really, really difficult emotions and really heavy topics. So they provided some really amazing training for their volunteers and staff. We also have something called the Commemorative Museum Pedagogy, which is an amazing book. I really highly recommend it to anyone working in a museum space, which examines how we can address grief at heritage sites. So, we have these things that are being done, which is wonderful, but we do need more, especially for other negative emotions. So we kind of tend to focus on the, for lack of a better term, safer negative emotions, the ones that people can feel okay about, versus some of the other ones that are a bit more challenging. Which brings me to my actual project, so belonging-centered dialogue for guilt. I've been going back and forth between using artifact-centered dialogue or belonging-centered dialogue. I'm leaning towards belonging-centered dialogue now. The main idea, though, is just how can we use these objects in our care to discuss these things? And if anyone can figure out how to get the A in there, or specifically how to get an E in there, so it can be like A, B, C, D, E, I'd really enjoy that. It's something I've been thinking about. So, please let me know if you come up with a way. But that actually brings me back to the emotions themselves. So what are shame and guilt? There's something that we use linguistically very similarly. People will put them always together. You'll hear things like shame and guilt, never guilt and shame, but shame and guilt goes together quite a bit. And we kind of use them interchangeably as a society, but psychologically, there are quite distinct emotions. Both of these things are considered complex emotions. They're something that you learn a little bit later on in life. So they're not kind of the first emotions that you learn as a child. To experience them, you have to have an understanding of your community. It's entirely based in the notion that, we are impacted and we impact others around us. So it is kind of this more complex feeling. Guilt itself is not actually that bad. Guilt is the feeling that occurs when an individual recognizes that an action or belief has transgressed culturally contingent social morals and conventions, potentially causing harm. That is the very, very long-winded way of saying guilt is, I did a bad thing. Shame, on the other hand, is more consistently negative. Shame puts all the blame for that action on oneself. So rather than I did a bad thing, it's I am bad because I did this thing. The focus is on yourself rather than the action. And that really limits how you can react to the emotion, because it also limits what you can do. So when the issue is yourself, there's only so much that you can change and respond to. If you're inherently bad, there's not a lot of places for you to go, which means that you start getting that isolation, the despair and depression, as also the defensiveness, because you don't want to be bad. So you try and make yourself feel like it's not you, it's not a thing. Whereas guilt, because it's so action focused, does actually allow for positive movement forward. So guilt can build empathy. It encourages honesty, it promotes a desire to make amends, and promotes a desire to avoid causing future harm. So all of those things are really positive, and they're central to the ideologies that we have regarding reconciliation and, social growth, social cohesion, all of those things. Guilt is actually a really important emotion for us to experience to keep communities kind of working together. Now, having said that, when I do my BCD model, I don't try and force anyone to feel guilty. My goal is not to make you feel guilty, or definitely not to make you feel ashamed, but rather to provide a space where people who are feeling those emotions can discuss them. And so I follow a kind of arc of dialogue model that I have adjusted to include this extra kind of psychology basis and to include this focus on guilt and shame. And so this is the basics of the model. You start by creating a community. So you create dialogue, ground rules, make sure that your visitors, your participants understand that the discussion that's going to be happening might get heavy, that you're not going to allow slurs or anything like that. I try and keep the ground rules pretty minimal because I want to provide a space where people feel like they can talk, and providing too many barriers to that makes people feel like they aren't able to share. But it is important so that people know what they're going into. Then the next thing that I do is introduce the social object. So this is where the actual archaeology, the artifact, comes in play. I'm going to talk about the two social objects I used in a couple of slides, but they are there. This is kind of where people get to experience them. Depending on the object, they might get to feel them firsthand, engage with them, and kind of share their opinions, share their observations, things like that. The next is to develop links. And this is where the object becomes really, really powerful. They can use that object to connect themselves to this history and also to connect themselves with each other. So once we kind of have this developing link set up, we go into the learn more. And this is where the hard facts come out. So the object is placed in its archaeological and historical context. You're providing alternative voices, you're giving information to people so that they have the accurate information and tools to kind of figure out how they feel going forward. And then we kind of provide the space for the emotional part of the conversation. So this is the reflection reaction. You provide a place where visitors can reflect on their emotional response, share about it if they would like to. And then this is also where I provide that explanation between shame and guilt, explain the difference, and provide some tools for how you can address it. This is the bulk of any of these conversations, or at least in my experience, has become the bulk of any of these conversations. And then at the end, we kind of summarize the experiences and resources are provided. I always provide resources about shame and guilt and about reconciliation. Also, helplines are included in my resources, all of those sorts of things. I think that that's probably one of the most important stuff I can provide. At the end of the session, I have the resource kind of with me if anyone would like it, so I'm happy to share it around as well. So social objects themselves are just a kind of fancy way of saying the archaeological materials. The idea being that by having this third focus, it makes dialogue a little bit easier because you're not having to stare someone deeply in the eye and tell them your greatest secrets. You kind of have this thing around which conversation can happen. So this is my first social object. I did this study at 2 different museums. The first one was St. Mary's Museum in St. Mary's, Ontario. And I think I saw the St. Mary's crew online, which is really exciting. Hello, I'm very excited to have you on, which is awesome. I was able to work with them. They were the most amazing people. I had an amazing time at the museum. Thank you again. So when I went to St. Mary's, I was able to use their collection of readers. So early books for education, classroom books, and things like that. Oh, okay, I did see you online. That's awesome. Sorry. Now, these readers, again, I'm going to talk about a little bit later, but there's something that theoretically any museum could have. A social object does not have to be fancy. It does not have to be kind of shiny. I really think that there is value in any of the objects that you have in your collection. These ones were really amazing because they were actually part of the teaching collection, which meant that the participants could get hands-on. Now, I did want to talk a little bit more about that kind of middle section, which is the providing resources around guilt and shame. This is one of the things that I provide at the end, like I mentioned, and it also kind of really outlines the process, what I recommend people do. And this is based on a lot of psychological research and also my own experiences. I'll be quite honest with you. I have found that the most important part of these conversations is being very honest about my own research and my own journey. And so it's been really powerful to be able to share that with people and hear people's experiences in return. So a big part of any sort of emotional intelligence is naming the emotion itself. So identifying if you're feeling guilt, shame, anger, grief, has a little definitions there. And then identify what its origin is and what its impact is. So a lot of times when people are feeling negative in a museum, it's kind of this nebulous thing. And by actually putting words to it of, I feel really bad because of this, can be quite powerful because, again, it gives you that action to respond to. Now, one of the things that I really highlight for people is that sometimes you might need to reframe your emotion as guilt. So if you're feeling shame, try to put it in a way where you reframe it as guilt, because then it gives you something to do. So rather than I'm a bad person because I'm a settler and Canada's history was very violent, that's not very helpful. That's not very useful. It's something that a lot of people experience, but in and of itself, it's not going to actually improve anyone's life. So when you can try and find an action instead and reframe it as guilt, that will be better. And most of the time, I would say 90% of the time when people are in these sessions, what comes out is I feel guilty because I didn't know this, or I feel guilty because I learned this too late. I feel guilty because it was something that was beyond my awareness. It's something I never thought about. And so when you kind of allow yourself to focus on that gives you something that you can respond to. And it doesn't have to be this huge thing, but it can give you this ability to move forward. So I need to learn more about this topic. I feel guilty, and it's important that I listen to Indigenous voices. I feel guilty, and I will do it better next time if it's for something maybe you said wrong or whatever it might be. It kind of allows you to provide that actionable item, very much like your junior high SMART goals, versus having the shame be focused inward on yourself for something that you can't control. And also, at the end of it too, realizing that it's something that you are in a position to maybe not fix immediately. And it's just going to have to live with that discomfort for a little while. So when I did my 2 sessions, the first one I did was at St. Mary's. It was part of their National Day of Truth and Reconciliation programming. And I was able to use those historical textbooks as social objects. So I did 8 sessions of over 90 minutes with about 34 participants. Each session, I think, ran late, which was really amazing. People were so engaged in the session that even though they were supposed to only be like 75 minutes long, people kept wanting to talk. And kept wanting to have that space for these communications, which was really, really wonderful. Participants of different ages, religious backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, genders. It was something that I wanted to make sure it was like very open. But having said that, the sessions themselves were designed for settlers. So anyone was welcome to come, but it was a session that was designed for settlers in Canada, talking about the guilt and shame that they felt around learning about these histories, specifically around Canada's role in operating residential schools, rather than anything kind of more for Indigenous communities. I hosted a second series of sessions in Winnipeg at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. So a really wonderful kind of array of experiences, 2 very different museums, and also 2 very different social objects. So I use the digital witness blanket as my social object in this case, because the Canadian Museum for Human Rights is very ephemeral in its approach. It doesn't actually have a lot of artifacts on hand. However, having said that, the witness blanket is going back there in the next couple of months. But again, we did a lot of sessions with about 37 participants of all different backgrounds, Indigenous and settler, and we had some really incredible conversations. One thing that I will take this moment to do is also highlight the witness blanket. It is an amazing resource, as well as a phenomenal piece of art. It's free to access online for kind of information about it, and it is incredibly impactful to hear the stories of all of those different objects, because the blanket itself, for those who are not familiar, is actually made up of archaeological artifacts. So all of the items in that kind of display that you see there at the bottom of the screen are physical things that people have donated to Carrie Newman, who created it, to kind of tell this story. And it's truly amazing. So having worked at those places, I wanted to see if I was able to do the following. And this kind of objective format was created based on something I worked with when I worked with the Emotive Project, which was thankfully very kindly why I have all of those publications. I did it during my master's degree, and it was a program that was based on how we can look at emotions in heritage spaces, but specifically positive emotions. I did empathy in my master's degree. So to consider this a success, I wanted to see if participants acknowledged their emotional reaction or just reflected on it. Even if they didn't necessarily say, I feel this or I feel that, having an opportunity for them to kind of reflect on that emotional experience, that was the goal. Cognitively, I wanted to see if they learned anything new, or had a change in perspective, was challenged in some kind of like factual, academic-y way. Value parameter, I wanted to know if they actually thought there was a value in the program, if this is something that they would recommend, if this was something that they would do. And then last but not least, my big one, the one that I was hopeful about, but I think is also the most difficult to prove, was the aspirational parameter, which was checking to see if basically participants actually did anything with the information that they received. Did it change their actions going forward? Did it make them reconsider things like that? So for my analysis, which like I said, I'm still kind of in the middle of, but I essentially took my recordings, video recordings and audio recordings of all of my sessions, transcribed them, and have been going through and doing a Straussian approach to grounded theory to code all of the data. In addition to that, I had a series of questionnaires. So I had questionnaires at the front of the session to kind of get some information about the participants. And then I also followed up 6 weeks after the sessions to get more information about how they kind of felt about the session after some time had passed. So I wanted to notice any kind of common themes, see if there was any specific indicators of like educational reception, or alternatively, if there were any indicators that people were trying to avoid learning in the sessions. And I was also curious about the impact of digital versus physical social objects, because in the one museum, we had iPads that I carried around and had people kind of able to explore. And in St. Mary's, we were able to physically get kind of in touch with the books themselves. So ultimately, we are looking to determine if the program fulfilled its goals. And the answer is, I think it did. I have more research to do, but initial findings have been incredibly positive. These are from those post-session questionnaires. So the number of times participants thought about the session in the 6 weeks following the session. And also, most importantly to me, the number of times participants spoke with others about the session in the 6 weeks after the event. So, we have 32% of people who talked to 3 to 5 other people about that session, which is pretty amazing. Honestly, it was much better than I expected, which was a great thing to have happen in my life. But like these things really kind of stuck with people in a way that I think we don't have a lot of comparative data. Unfortunately, longitudinal studies are just not something that happen. I think, as most of you are well aware, people just don't have the opportunity or the funding to do that. And so even though 6 weeks can't necessarily be considered longitudinal, it's still more than we normally get. And so unfortunately, there's not tons to kind of compare it to. But what is out there is this is a much higher rate of engagement after the session has closed than what we normally see in kind of museum programming. And this is a series of kind of participant comments. So as you can tell, there is a huge array of people who say a lot of varying things, and some of them have some really amazing like self-reflection on them. Other ones are also critical and provide amazing feedback on what I can do more of going forward. But in general, what I think really came through in these comments are that people found the distinctions very helpful. And also that just finding a space to have these conversations was valid in and of itself. So, I appreciated the session. It was a good way to evaluate myself. The fact that it was in a group was really useful, all of that sort of stuff. It really came out in their comments. And then also, through the actual sessions, when I'm going through and I'm doing my analysis and evaluating, coding what's being said in the sessions, people are quite emotional, and they were very powerful. And as someone who sat through all of them, they really do hit home. Like, I learned some amazing things and had some really incredible moments of like just shared humanity with people during these, where I think it really did, like, the impact on people was clear. And from the kind of feedback that I got, how people valued these sessions was also really clear. So that brings me to kind of my key takeaways, that negative emotions are being experienced. So by our visitors, but also one thing that I kind of ended up talking about more in my own research was also by staff and professionals. So when I worked with the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, I had about 50% members of the public and 50% of their kind of volunteers participate. And so people who were engaged with the museum already. And a lot of times the people who were actually engaged with the museum and the people giving tours and things like that showed more value for this than the people who were in their kind of day-to-day life. And this comes up with a bigger takeaway, which is something that I'm currently working on in a paper and I'm trying to figure out how to address, which is, to a degree, the fact that these programs are kind of, for lack of a better term, preaching to the choir. People who sign up for these programs are people who are along their journey already quite far. We're not necessarily challenging people who are still at that phase where they feel really defensive, but rather providing tools for people who are kind of already further along in a kind of their own awareness of how they're responding to these topics. But those negative emotions are there, and they're there at all levels of engagement with heritage and engagement with archaeology. Acknowledging that they're there is impactful, really, in and of itself. Providing space for those conversations is even more impactful. So the final kind of numbers, at least, which is, again, seems low, but in comparison, it's actually quite high. 11% of the participants, of everyone who participated, spoke about the session to other people 3 or more times. So a tenth of the people who participated ended up taking that forward to at least 3 other people. This is incredible, and it could be much higher because, as I was complaining about earlier, I was only able to get about like a 30% return rate on the questionnaires. And so we didn't have the exact numbers. Having said that, I do think that it's probably fairly accurate because the numbers of people, the people who would return the questionnaires are the people who were most likely to talk about the session to others. So there is kind of an interesting dialogue there, again, about that preaching to the choir. But it is something that people are taking away, and they're using these tools to kind of consider how they're going to act in the future, which, not act, but respond, I guess, and how they can make themselves feel better in a way that is still acknowledging all of the difficult, nature of Canadian history. And so I was really grateful for all my participants who kind of were able to respond to me and provide that extra information 6 weeks after the session. It's a heck of a thing to get an email saying, "Hi, do you remember me?" But it really did kind of indicate that these are things that are then encouraging broader conversation, which is what kind of needs to be done. So on the right here, I do have my other part of the resources I give, which are my kind of reconciliation recommendations. And these were all put together by other groups. So a large part of them were from the Oceanic Leadership Council, and also are in like the NTRC campaign 94 in 94. And they're just different resources and places where people can listen to those other voices, because one of the things that is kind of inherent in these sessions is, as a settler myself, we're talking about the settler experience. And so I always focus on, especially when we were discussing residential schools, the government's response, rather than any sort of Indigenous experience or people who had survived them, because that's just not my place to talk about. I'm not related to survivors. I don't have those experiences. So I do always want to make sure, and I want to bring it forth to you as well, that there are really, really amazing and powerful resources out there where survivors are telling their story. And it's one of the most important things I can do is just tell people, that these are there, and recommend that they listen to those voices. Last little bit too, as I go into my thank you, is also the Woodland Cultural Center. I know most of you are probably very familiar with it, but they do virtual tours of the residential school on the center site. And those are all done as a part of a charity work, and their kind of goal to keep the evidence and keep the museum open to talk about the history of Canadian residential schools, as well as other amazing work as the cultural center itself. So I do like to shout them out. I'm in no way affiliated with them at the end of these sessions, but just as part of the work that I've done, I've come across their work quite a bit. And I do like to just say, if you're looking for more information from a non-settler kind of perspective, they are a great place to start. And they're really wonderful, just to end it there. But that is my presentation. So thank you so much for listening through my long spiel. I'm more than happy to answer any questions either now, or if you have questions, you can email me. My email is on the screen there.